Everyone. So I'm currently editing and preparing to upload this video to YouTube, so it's backed up somewhere, but because of the content, it deserves a bit of a preface. This is not my normal style at all. If you normally just like putting on my voice and listening, here are a couple other readings you will probably much prefer. There's going to be a lot of soapboxing and opinions here, and although I stand by all of them, it's just not my normal steez. So there you go.
Okay, there we go. Hey everyone. So this is Phoebe. Um, this is going to be a bit of an unorthodox, cozy corner stream tonight. As you can see, I am not in my normal setup. I'm not in the cozy corner with the cozy chair and the cozy blanket and the cozy cat. Uh, I am, like many of you probably, my fellow Americans, feeling pretty going through some prolonged grief right now about our political process. So I thought it would be really nice if I would just kind of check in and do some different readings to kind of just buoy one's heart in these times. I'm going to start off with some Foucault and then do some excerpts from, yeah, these babes, and then a bit of a secret surprise at the end. Um, Before I get too far into it, I do just kind of want to soapbox for a minute and let any of you all watching right now know that, and I will probably cut out this part when I back up the stream to my YouTube channel because I try to keep the reading persona very separate from my personal life and my personal politics. But I'm a lifelong anarchist. I've been involved in anarchist organizing and volunteering since I was about 15. Um, and I know a decade isn't much in the grand scheme, but it means a lot to me. And I've always nursed this vision ultimately of being beyond the state apparatus. And I want you to know that if you are feeling grief and anger right now at what is essentially a very bizarre, highly moralized sham election two with a more amicable, certainly, puppet candidate, and I completely understand, and I'm here for you. Um, I I hate everything going on so much right now. I want so desperately to live out the life that I know we all deserve, free of this constraint, this state, this government. Um, and whatever happens tonight and tomorrow morning, I just want you to know that I am with you in spirit and to remind you that the work is not over. Uh, the work has really only just begun. This isn't even a blink in the eye of American history, and we we have a long way to go. So I figured what I would start off with tonight would be the third lecture from Foucault's Society Must Be Defended, his series of lectures at the Collège de France in, I believe, starting in 1972 through 1973. I read this a few weeks ago as part of my research that I'm doing into the bad stuff, and it really struck me, and I feel that it's something that anyone listening right now trying to actively avoid election coverage and feeling this grief would relate to. So let me get settled in. And here we go. Also, for the record, I know I'm usually such a hard ass about having like a physical copy of the book, but I've only been able to get this one through the library, and I have a slightly of ambiguous provenance one on my really old e-reader. Uh, so I'm gonna try and read off of this one. Let's see how this goes. Lecture 3, 21st of January, 1976. Last time we said a sort of farewell to the theory of sovereignty insofar as it could and can be described as a method for analyzing power relations. I would like to show you that the juridical model of sovereignty was not, I believe, able to provide a concrete analysis of the multiplicity of power relations. In fact, it seems to me, to sum it all up in a few words, in 3 words to be precise, that the theory of sovereignty necessarily tries to establish what I would call a cycle, the subject-to-subject cycle, and to show how a subject understood as meaning as individual who is naturally endowed or endowed by the nature with rights, capabilities, and so on, can and must become a subject, this time in the sense of an element that is subjectified in the power relationship. And this does get more immediately relevant. Uh, I picked out this lecture with a very, very specific passage in mind. And forgive me if I kind of start crying when I get to it. Sovereignty is the theory that goes from subject to subject, that establishes the political relationship between subject and subject. Second, it seems to me that the theory of sovereignty assumes from the outset the existence of a multiplicity of powers that are not powers in the political sense of the term. Rather, they are capacities, possibilities, potentials, and it can constitute them as powers in the political sense of the term only if it has, in the meantime, established a moment of fundamental and foundational unity between possibilities and powers, namely the unity of power. Whether this unity of power takes on the face of a monarch or the form of the state is irrelevant. The various forms, aspects, mechanisms, and institutions of power will be derived from this unitary power. The multiplicity of powers, in the sense of political powers, can be established and can function only on the basis of this unitary power, which is founded by the theory of sovereignty. Third, and finally, it seems to me that the theory of sovereignty shows, or attempts to show, how a power can be constituted, not exactly in accordance with the law, but in accordance with a certain basic legitimacy that is more basic than any law and that allows laws to function as such. The theory of sovereignty is, in other words, the subject-to-subject cycle, the cycle of power and powers, and the cycle of legitimacy in law. So we can say that in one way or another, and depending obviously on the different theoretical schemata in which it is deployed, the theory of sovereignty presupposes the subject, its goal is to establish the essential unity of power, and it is always deployed within the pre-existing element of the law. It therefore assumes that the existence of 3 primitive elements, a subject who has to be subjectified, the unity of power that has to be founded, and the legitimacy of sovereignty comes into play, I think, among these elements, and it takes them as a given and tries to found them. My project, sorry, this is a terrible quality PDF. My project, which I immediately abandoned, relatable, was to show how the instrument of that political psychological analysis acquired almost 300 or 400 years ago, in other words, the notion of repression, which does look rather as though it was borrowed from Freudianism or Freudo-Marxism, was in fact inscribed in an interpretation of power as sovereignty. To do that would, however, take us back over the things that have already been said, so I will move on. Though I may come back to this at the end of the year if we have enough time left. Spoiler alert, there's never enough time left. The general project, both in previous years and this year, is to try to release or emancipate this analysis of power from 3 of subject unity and law, and to bring out, rather than these basic elements of sovereignty, what I would call relations or operators of domination. Rather than deriving powers from sovereignty, we should be extracting operators of domination from relations of power, both historically and empirically. A theory of dominations, rather than a theory of sovereignty. This means that rather than starting with the subject or even subjects and elements that exist prior to the relationship that can be localized, we begin with the power relationship itself, with the actual or effective relationship of domination, and see how that relationship itself determines the elements to which it is applied. We should not, therefore, be asking subjects how, why, and by what right they can agree to become subjugated. Do you see where I'm going with this, guys? We're getting there. The right that they can agree to become subjugated, but rather how actual relations of subjugation manufacture subjects. Our second task would be to reveal relations of domination and to allow them to assert themselves in their multiplicity, their differences, their specificity, or their reversibility. We should not be looking for a sort of sovereignty from which powers spring, but showing how it is the various operators of domination support one another, relate to one another, and how they converge and reinforce one another in some cases, and negate or strive to annul one another in other cases. I'm obviously not saying that great apparatuses of power do not exist, or that we can neither get at them nor describe them, but I do think that they always function at the base of these apparatuses of domination. To put it in more concrete terms, we can obviously describe a given society's school apparatus or its set of educational apparatuses, but I think we can analyze them effectively only if we do not see them as an overall unity, but only if we do not try to derive them from something like the statist unity of sovereignty. We can analyze them only if we try to see how they interact, how they support one another, and how this apparatus defines a certain number of global strategies on the basis of multiple subjugations of child to adult, to progeny to parents, ignorance to knowledge, apprentice to master, family to administration, and so on. All of these mechanisms and operators of domination are the actual plinth of the global apparatus that is the school apparatus. So, if you'd like, we shall have to see the structures of power as global strategies that traverse and use local tactics of domination. Give me one moment, let me just make sure of something. This e-reader's from 2012. It's glitching out a bit. So, if you'd like, we have to see the structures of power as global strategies that traverse and use local tactics of domination. Third, and finally, revealing relations of domination rather than the sources of sovereignty means this. We do not try to trace their origins back to that which gives them their basic legitimacy. We have to try, on the contrary, to identify the technical instruments that guarantee that they function. So to sum up, and to, if not settle the issue for the moment, at least clarify it somewhat, rather than looking at the three prerequisites of law, unity, and subject, which make sovereignty both the source of power and the basis of institutions, I think that we have to adapt the threefold point of view of the techniques, the heterogeneity of techniques, and the subjugation effects that make technologies of domination the real fabric of both power relations and the greater apparatuses of power. The manufacture of subjects rather than the genesis of the sovereign is our general theme. But while it is quite clear that relations of domination provide access road that leads to the analyses of power, how can we analyze these relations of domination? While it is true that we should be studying domination and not sovereignty, or rather that we should be studying dominations and operators of domination, how can we pursue our analysis of relations of domination? To what extent can a relationship of domination boil down or be reduced to the notion of a relationship of force? In what context and how can the relationship of force be reduced to a relationship of war? And for the record, for anyone who has not previously read or encountered Society Must Be Defended as part of Foucault's wider work on biopolitics in his the later end of his career, his ultimate assertion here, I'm not going to spoil it. I'm not going to spoil it. You're in for a ride. Never mind. That is, so to speak, the preliminary question I would like to look at a bit this year. Can war really provide a valid analysis of power relations, and can it act as the matrix for techniques of domination? You might say to me that we cannot, from the outset, confuse power relations with relations of war. Of course not. I am simply taking an extreme case to the extent that war can be regarded as the point of maximum tension, or as forced relations laid bare. Is the power relationship basically a relationship of confrontation, a struggle to the death, or a war? If we look beneath peace, order, wealth, and authorities, beneath the calm order of the subordinates between the state and state apparatuses, beneath the laws and so on, will we hear and discover a sort of primitive and permanent war? I would like to begin by asking this question, and not forgetting that we will also have to raise a whole series of other questions. I will try to deal with them in years to come. As a first approximation, we can simply say that they include the following questions. Can the phenomenon of war be regarded as a primary with respect to other relations of inequity, dissymmetries, divisions of labor, relations of exploitation, etc.? Must it be regarded as primary? Can we and must we group together in the general mechanism, the general form known as war, phenomena such as antagonism, rivalry, confrontation, and struggles between individual groups or classes? We might also ask whether notions derived from what was known in the 18th century and even the 19th century as the art of war, i.e. strategy, tactics, etc., constitute in themselves a valid and inadequate instrument for the analysis of power relations. We could and must also ask ourselves if military institutions and the practices that surround them, and in more general terms, all the techniques that are used to fight a war, are, whichever way we look at them, directly or indirectly, the nucleus of political institutions. And finally, the first question I would like to study this year is, how, when, and why was it noticed or imagined that what is going on beneath and in power relations is as a war? How, when, how, and why did someone come up with that idea that it is a sort of uninterrupted battle that shapes peace, and that the civil order, its basis, its essence, its essential mechanisms, is basically is the order of battle? Who came up with this idea that the civil order is an order of battle? Who saw war just beneath the surface of peace? Who sought in the noise and confusion of war, in the mud of battles, the principle that then allows us to understand order, the state, its institutions, and its history? That, then, is the question I am going to pursue a bit in the coming lectures, and perhaps for the rest of the year. Basically, the question can be put very simply, and that is how I began to put it myself. Who, basically, has had the idea of inverting Clausewitz's principle, and who thought of saying it is quite possible that war is the continuation of politics by other means, but isn't politics itself a continuation of war by other means? And for the record, Clausewitz's principle is that, gosh, I can never actually specifically remember its original or its inverse, but specifically that war is the continuation of politics in society. That's it. Now that I think that the problem is not so much who inverted Clausewitz's principle as it is the question of the principle Clausewitz inverted, hence why it's complicated. When he said, "But after all, war is no more than a continuation of politics," I in fact think and will attempt to prove that the principle that war is a continuation of politics by other means was a principle that had existed long before Clausewitz, who simply inverted a sort of thesis that had been in circulation since the 17th and 18th centuries and which was both diffuse and specific. So, this brings us to it. Politics is the continuation of war by other means. This thesis, and the very existence of this thesis, which predates Clausewitz, contains a sort of historical paradox. We can indeed say, schematically and somewhat crudely, that the growth and development of states throughout the Middle Ages and up to the threshold of this modern era, we see practices and institutions of war undergoing a marked, very visible change, which can be characterized thus. The practices and institutions of war were initially concentrated in the hand of central power. It gradually transpired that in both de facto and de jure terms, only state powers could wage wars and manipulate the instruments of war. The state acquired a monopoly on war. The immediate effect of the state monopoly was that what might be called day-to-day warfare and what might actually be called private warfare was eradicated from the social body, from the relations among men, relations among groups. Increasingly, wars, the practices of war, and the institutions of war tended to exist, so to speak, only on the frontiers, on the outer limits of great state units, only as a violent relationship that actually existed or threatened to exist between states. But gradually the entire social body was cleansed of this bellicose relation that had permeated that's a weird translation, through and through during the Middle Ages. So, thanks to the establishment of the state monopoly and to the fact that war, now, so to speak, a practice that functioned only in the outer limits of the state, it tended to become the technical and professional prerogative of a carefully defined and controlled military apparatus. You know what? I'm going to skip to it. Oh, there we go. I found it. I needed to read this right now. There are winners and losers, and the losers are at the mercy of the winners at their disposal. Let us look now at what happens. The vanquished are at the disposal of the victors. In other words, the victors can kill them. If they kill them, the problem obviously goes away. The sovereignty of the state disappears simply because the individuals who make up the state. I am currently reading Foucault's Society Must Be Defended from his lecture series at the Collège de France from 1972 on. I skipped from lecture 3 to, I'm now in the middle of lecture 5. But I'm not reading the whole lectures. I'm actually moving on to something else right after this. I just really needed to read this to someone. I needed to read this and have it be witnessed. If they kill them, the problem obviously goes away. The sovereignty of the state disappears simply because the individuals who make up the state are dead. But what happens if the victors spare the lives of the vanquished? If they spare their lives, or if the defeated are granted the temporary privilege of life, one of two things may happen. Either they will rebel against the victors, or in other words, begin a new war and try to overthrow the relation of forces which takes us back to the real war that their defeat had, at for least a time, interrupted. Either they risk their lives, or they do not begin a new war and agree to work for and obey the others, to surrender their land to the victors, to pay them taxes. Here we obviously have a relationship of domination based entirely upon war, the prolongation during peacetime, of the effects of war. Domination, you say, and not sovereignty, but Hobbes does not say that. He says we are still in a relationship of sovereignty. Why? Because once the defeated have shown a preference for life and obedience, they make their victors their representatives and restore sovereign to replace the one who was killed in the war. Fuck Hobbes, man. Fuck Hobbes. It is therefore not the defeat that leads to the brutal and illegal establishment of a society based upon domination, slavery, and servitude. It is what happens when the defeat, or even after the battle, even after the defeat, and in a way, independently of it. It is fear, the renunciation of fear, the renunciation of the risk of death. It is this that introduces us into the order of sovereignty and into the juridical regime, that of absolute power. The will to prefer life to death. That is what founds sovereignty, and it is as juridical and legitimate as the sovereignty that was established through mode of institution and mutual agreement. Strangely enough, Hobbes adds a third form of sovereignty to these forms, by acquisition and institution, and states that it is very similar to the institution by acquisition that appears at the end of the war and after the defeat. This type of sovereignty, he says, is the type that binds a child to its parents, or more specifically, its mother. Take, he says, a newborn child, its parents, its father in a civil society, or its mother in the state of nature, could simply allow it to die, or quite simply have put it to death. It cannot in any case live without its parents, without its mother, and for years the child will, quite spontaneously, without having to express its will other than through the manifestation of its needs, its cries, its fear, and so on, obey its parents and do exactly what it is told because its life depends upon her and her alone. She will enjoy sovereignty over it. The mother will. Now, Hobbes says that there is no essential difference between the way a child consents to its mother's sovereignty in order to preserve its own life, and the way that the defeated give their consent when the battle is over. What Hobbes is trying to demonstrate is that the decisive factor in the establishment of sovereignty is not the quality of the will, or even its form or level of expression. Basically, it does not matter if we have a knife to our throats, or if what we want is explicitly formulated or not. For sovereignty to exist, there must be, and this is all that there must be, a certain radical will to make us want to live, even though we cannot do so unless the other is willing to let us live. Sovereignty is, therefore, constituted on the basis of a radical form of will, but it counts for little. That will is bound up with fear, and sovereignty is never shaped from above, or, in other words, on the basis of a decision taken by the strong, the victor, or the parents. Sovereignty is always shaped from below, and by those who are afraid. Despite the apparent differences between the two great forms of commonwealth, a commonwealth of institution born of mutual agreement, and the commonwealth of acquisition born of battle, the mechanism at work are at bottom identical. No matter where we are talking about a covenant, a battle, relations between parents and children, we always find the same series: will, fear, and sovereignty. It is irrelevant whether the series is triggered by an implicit calculation, a relationship of violence, or a fact of nature. It is irrelevant whether it is fear, the knife at our throats, the weeping of a child, that gives rise to a never-ending diplomacy. Sovereignty will be constituted in any case. Basically, it is as though, far from being the fiercest of relationships between war and political power, Hobbes wanted to eliminate the historical reality of war as though he wanted to eliminate the genesis of sovereignty. A large part of the discourse of Leviathan consists in saying it doesn't matter whether you fought or did not fight, whether you were beaten or not in any case. The mechanism that applies to you, who have been defeated, is the same mechanism that applies, that we find in the state of nature, that it is natural in the constitution of a state, and that we also find, quite naturally, the most tender and natural relationship of all, that between the parents and children. Hobbes turns war, the fact of war, and the relationship of force that is manifested in the battle, in the state, into something that has nothing to do with the constitution of sovereignty. The establishment of sovereignty has nothing to do with war. Basically, Hobbes' discourse is a certain no to war. It is not really war that gives birth to states, and it is not really war that transcribes relations of power and sovereignty, or that reproduces within civil power and its inequities the earlier dissymmetries in the relationships of force that were revealed by the very fact of the battle itself. Hence the problem. To whom, to what, is this elimination of war addressed, given that no previous theory of power has given war the role that Hobbes so stubbornly denies it? Basically, what adversary is Hobbes addressing when, in whole sections and a whole stratum, a whole line of his discourse, he obstinately repeats, but in any case, it does not matter whether there was war or not. The constitution of sovereignties has nothing to do with war to him. I think that what Holmes's discourse is addressing is not, if you'd like, a specific or determinate theory, or something that could be defined as his adversary, his partner in polemic, nor is it something that could be defined as the unspoken, unavoidable problem in Hobbes's discourse. After all, philosophy and right, or philosophico-juridical discourse would rather give the state too much power than not enough power. And while they do criticize Hobbes for giving the state too much power, they are secretly grateful for him to having warded off a certain insidious and barbarous enemy. The enemy, or rather the enemy discourse Hobbes is addressing, is the discourse that could be heard in the civil struggles that were tearing the state apart in England at the time. It was a discourse that spoke with two voices. One was saying, "We are the conquerors and you are the vanquished. We may well be foreigners, but you are the servants." To which the other voice replied, "We may well have been conquered, but we will not remain conquered. This is our land and you will leave it." And this is where Foucault gets into his analysis of the Norman conquest and all of that jazz. But specifically, when I sat down, I was reading this on a bus. And I think I've actually may have mentioned this to a couple of friends of mine in philbook. I was reading that on the bus, and when I got to the line of the knife at our throats, it occurred to me, wow, the institution, as Foucault refers to it, the state apparatus, could kill us at any time. And there's a reason we're not killed. There's a reason why people aren't wholesale, overtly eliminated, as we see looking back in different ethnicides and genocides in history. Although there are certainly slow-motion holocausts happening now in terms of criminalization, the criminal justice system specifically here in America, healthcare, Jesus, this police brutality even plays into that. All of these are slow-motion holocausts. And they are the modes of dominance asserted by a state apparatus, the victors, over the captive, subjugated people. And that really broke me. And I think of that passage now, moving into the events of tomorrow and this entire election. Because it doesn't matter, ultimately. Yes, it matters in the immediate sense with regards to specific certain policy makings, but will those things really, truly make a difference at this point? How far down have we gone as a nation for certain things to be reformable? Because even the blues, even the neoliberal apparatus that all of us are kind of crossing our fingers for, relies on this dichotomy of the subjugated, of the alienated, in perpetual states of disempowerment. And so that's what I wanted to read. And I apologize for anyone who's actually stuck this long. That it took me 20 minutes to find that. But that takes me into Jean-Paul Marat? It's one of those names I have read multiple times, but never actually said aloud. Are We Undone? And this was published in 1790, and this is from my Dover Thrift Editions. Yeah, getting real radical up in here. Are we undone? An appeal to all citizens. Citizens, our enemies stand without the gates. The masters have had the frontiers open to them under the pretext of granting them free passage through our country. Perhaps, at this very moment, they are advancing in our direction with great speed. The king will go to Compagnon, where the apartments for his reception have already been prepared. The road from Compiègne to Toul or Metz can easily be traveled incognito. What will prevent him from joining the Austrian army, and with the troops of the line which have remained faithful to him? Soon he will be surrounded by hosts of army officers who is, okay, blah, 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 blah. Where are you? Oh, I forgot how this one was boring. There we go. Okay, it's not boring, it's just not giving me those big catharsis feelings I want right now. And I really don't want to be that chick who, like, reads Thomas Paine, you know? But to kind of give a bit of a summary of his intention with Marat's article here is what he's saying is this some accumulated in this final paragraph right here. The cutting off of 500 or 600 heads would have guaranteed your peace, liberty, and happiness. Mistaken humanity has crippled your arms and held back your blows. It will cost the lives of millions of your brothers. The soldiers of the National Guard shall escape death no more than the others. The French guards whom I have just mentioned, and all the soldiers who are deserting the king's flag and gathering under those of the nation, will be sacrificed first of all, in spite of all the pacifying sermons which the general is delivering to them. Your enemies need only to triumph for a moment. Remember, your enemies need only to triumph for a moment, and blood will flow in torrents. They will murder you without compassion. They will rip open the bellies of your wives, and in order to choke within you the love of liberty, their bloody hands will explore the entrails of your children to find their hearts. And I can imagine that in the current global pandemic, I, as an immunocompromised woman, like many other people, have been in the zone of, if I die from this, just drop my body on the steps on the steps of the fucking White House to call back to a very, very important sentiment of the AIDS crisis. We're being killed very actively. And just letting you know, it's a lot more, oh, not going to soapbox right now. I'm just going to move on to the first chapter in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, one of my anarcho-feminist heroes. Have you noticed I have a bit of a slant here at this point? Chapter 1. In the present state of society, it appears necessary to go back to first principles in search of all the most simple truths, and to dispute with some prevailing prejudice every inch of ground. To clear my way, I must be allowed to ask some plain questions, and the answers which will probably appear as unequivocal as the axioms on which reasoning is built, though, when entangled with various motives of action, they are formally contradicted either by the words or the conduct of men. In what does man's preeminence over the brute creation consist? The answer is clear, that a half is less than a whole in reason. What acquirement exalts one being above another? Virtue. Certainly, we spontaneously reply. For what purpose were the passions implanted? That by man struggling with them might attain a degree of knowledge denied to the brutes, whispers experience. Consequently, the perfection of our nature and capability of happiness must be estimated by the degree of reason, virtue, and knowledge that distinguish the individual and direct the laws which bind society. Oh yeah, we're getting conciliant here, going full circle. And that from the exercise of reason, knowledge, and virtue naturally flow, is equally undeniable if mankind be viewed collectively. The rights and duties of man thus simplified, it seems almost impertinent to attempt to illustrate truths that appear so incontrovertible, yet so deeply rooted prejudices have clouded reason, and such spurious qualities have assumed the name of virtues, that it is necessary to pursue the course of reason as it has been perplexed and involved in error by various adventitious, I actually can't pronounce that word at all, advantageous circumstances, comparing the single axiom of causal deviations. Men, in general, seem to employ their reason to justify prejudices, even which they have imbibed. They can scarcely trace how, rather than to root them out. The mind must be strong, that resolutely forms its own principles, for a kind of intellectual cowardice prevails, which makes many men shrink from the task, or to only do it by halves. Yet the imperfect conclusions thus drawn are frequently and very plausible, because they are built on partial experience, on just, though narrow views. Going back to first principles, vice skulks, with all of its native deformity, from close investigation, but a set of shallow reasoners are always exclaiming that these arguments prove too much, and are always exclaiming that at a rotten measure, and that a rotten measure at the core may be expedient. Thus, expediency is continually contrasted with simple principles, till truth is lost in a mist of words, virtue in forms, and knowledge rendered as surrounding nothing by the specious prejudices that assume its name. That the society is formed in the wisest manner, whose constitution is founded on the nature of man, strikes, in the abstract, every thinking being so forcibly that it looks like presumption to endeavor to bring forward proofs, though proof must be brought, or the strong hold of prescription will never be forced by reason. Yet to urge prescription is an argument to justify the depriving man or women, reminder, vindication, of their natural rights, is one of the absurd sophisms which daily insult common sense. The civilization of the bulk of the people of Europe is very partial, Nay, it may be made a question whether they have acquired any virtues in exchange for innocence equivalent to the misery produced by the vices that have been plastered over unsightly ignorance, and the freedom which has been bartered for splendid slavery. The desire of dazzling by riches, the most certain preeminence that man can obtain, the pleasure of commanding, flattering sycophants, and oh, flattering sycophants. Gee gosh, do I hear a bit of a Fox and Friends thing going on right now? And CNN. Yeah, you motherfuckers aren't innocent either. You shills. God, I'm actually like kind of shaking right now. I'm so angry. I haven't let myself actually get angry in a way that is shared so openly in a long time. And have many other complicated low calculations of doting self-love, and all have contributed to overwhelm the mass of mankind and make liberty a convenient handle for mock patriotism. For whilst rank and titles are held of the utmost importance, gee, how relevant must this be? Before which genius must hide its diminished head, it is, with few exceptions, very unfortunate for a nation when a man of abilities, without rank or property, pushes himself forward to notice. Alas, what unheard of misery Alas, what unheard of misery have thousands suffered to purchase a cardinal's hat for an intriguing, obscure adventurer who longed to be ranked with princes, or lord it over them by seizing the triple crown. Such, indeed, has been the wretchedness that has flowed from hereditary honors, riches, and monarchy, that men of lively sensibility have almost uttered blasphemy in order to justify the dispensations of Providence. Man has been held out as an independent of his power who... I'm sorry. Man has been held out as independent of his power who made him, or as a lawless planet darting from its orbit to steal the celestial fire of reason, and the vengeance of heaven lurking in the subtle flame like Pandora's pent-up mischiefs, sufficiently punished by his temerity, by introducing evil into the world. Impressed by this view of misery and disorder which pervaded society, and fatigued with jostling against artificial fools, Rousseau became enamored of solitude, and being at the same time an optimist, he labors with an uncommon eloquence to prove that man was naturally a solitary animal, misled by his respect for the goodness of God, who certainly, for what man of sense can feel and can doubt it, gave life only to communicate happiness. He considers evil as positive, and the work of man, not aware that he was exalting one attribute to the expense of another, equally necessary to divine perfection. Reared on a false hypothesis, his arguments in favor of a state of nature are plausible, but unsound. I say unsound, for to assert that the state of nature is preferable to civilization, and all of its possible perfection, is, in other words, to arraign supreme wisdom in the paradoxical exclamation that God has made all things right, and that error has been introduced by the creature whom he has formed, knowing that what he formed is as unphilosophical as it is impious. When that wise being who created us and placed us here saw the fair idea, he willed, by allowing it to be so, that the passion should unfold our reason, because he could see that our present evil would produce future good. Could the helpless creature whom he had called from nothing break loose from his providence and boldly learn to know that good by practicing evil without his permission? No. How could that energetic advocate for immortality argue so inconsistently? Had mankind remained forever in the brutal state of nature, which even his magic pen cannot paint, as a state in which a single virtue took root, it would have been clear, though not to the sensitive, unreflecting wanderer, that man was born to run the circle of life and death, and to adorn God's garden for some purpose which could not be easily reconciled with his attributes. But if, to the crown, the to cr- but if, to crown the whole, there were to be rational creatures produced, allowed to rise in excellence by the exercise of powers implanted for that purpose, if benignity, benignity, to be benign, itself thought fit to call into existence a creature above the brutes, who could think that and improve himself? Why should that inestimable gift, for a gift it was, if man was so created to have the capacity to rise above the state in which sensation produced brutal ease, be called in direct terms a curse? A curse it might be reckoned, if the whole of our existence were bound by our continuance in this world, for why should the gracious foundation of life give us passions, and the power of reflection only to embitter our days and inspire us with mistaken notions of dignity? Why should he lead us from love of ourselves to sublime emotions, which is let's skip ahead here. Okay, yeah, she really hates Rousseau, and I can't blame her. I agree. Here we go. Ah, but true to his first position next to a state of nature, Rousseau celebrates barbarism. Apostrophizing the shade of Fabricius, he forgets that, in conquering the world, the Romans never dreamed of establishing their own liberty on a firm basis or of extending the reign of virtue. Eager to support his system, he stigmatizes as vicious every effort of genius, and uttering the apotheosis of savage virtues, he exalts those to demigods who are scarcely human. The brutal Spartans, who, in defiance of justice and gratitude, sacrificed in cold blood the slaves who had shown themselves heroes to rescue their oppressors. Disgusted with artificial manners and virtues, the citizen of Geneva, instead of properly sifting the subject, threw away the wheat with the chaff, without waiting to inquire whether the evils which his ardent soul turned from indignantly were the consequence of civilization or the vestiges of barbarism. He saw vice tramping on virtue in the semblance of goodness taking place in reality. He saw talents bent by power to sinister purposes, and never thought of tracing the gigantic mischief up to arbitrary power, up to the hereditary distinctions that clash with the mental superiority that naturally rises a man above his fellows. He did not perceive that regal power in a few generations produces idiotism into the noble stem, and holds out to render thousands idle and vicious. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit more. What but a pestilential vapor can hover over society when its chief director is only instructed in the invention of crimes or the stupid routine of childish ceremonies? Will men never be wise? Will they never cease to expect corn from tares and figs from thistles? Is it possible for any man, when the most favorable circumstances occur, to acquire sufficient knowledge and strength of the mind to discharge the duties of a king entrusted with the uncontrolled power? How then they must be violated when his very elevation is an insuperable bar to the attainment of either wisdom or virtue? When all things of all feelings of the man are stifled by flattery, and reflection shunned out by pleasure. Surely it is madness to make the fate of thousands depend on the caprice of a weak fellow creature whose very station sinks him necessarily below the meanest of his subjects. But one power should not be thrown down and to exalt another, for all power inebriates weak men, and its abuse proves that the more equality there is established among men, the more virtue and happiness will reign in society. But this, and any similar maxim deduced from simple reason, raises an outcry. The church or the state is in danger, if the faith and the wisdom of antiquity is not implicit, and they who, roused by the sight of human calamity, dare to attack human authority are reviled as despisers of God. Gee, that sounds really familiar right now. And enemies of man. These are bitter calumnies, and yet they reached one of the best men, whose ashes still preach peace, and whose memory demands a respectful pause when subjects are discussed that lay so near to his heart. After attacking the sacred majesty of kings, presidents, there we go. I shall scarcely excite surprise by adding my firm persuasion that every profession in which great subordination of rank constitutes it. I'm going to read that again slowly because I feel like it deserves emphasis and I wasn't completely processing it. After attacking the sacred majesty of kings / presidents, although that's parenthetical, that's my parenthetical, there are no presidents here. I shall scarcely excite surprise by adding my firm persuasion that every profession in which great subordination of rank constitutes its power is highly injurious to morality. A standing army, for instance, is compatible with freedom because subordination and rigor are the very sinews of military discipline, and despotism is necessary to give vigor to enterprises that one will directs. A spirit inspired by romantic notions of honor, a kind of morality founded on the fashion of the age, can only be felt by a few officers, whilst the main body must be moved by command like the waves of the sea, for the strong wind of authority pushes the crowd of subalterns forward, they scarcely know or care why, with headlong fury. Besides, nothing can be so prejudicial to the morals of the inhabitants of country towns as the occasional residence of a set of idle, superficial young men, whose only occupation is its gallantry, whose polished manners render vice more dangerous by concealing its deformity under gay ornamental drapery, an air of fashion, which is but a badge of slavery, and proves that the soul has not a strong individual character, awes simple country people into an imitation of the vices, when they cannot catch the slippery graces of politeness. Every corps is a chain of despots, who, submitting and tyrannizing without exercising their reason, become dead weights of vice and folly on the community. A man of rank or fortune, sure of by rising interest, has nothing to do but to pursue some extravagant freak, whilst the needy gentleman, who is to rise as the phase turns, by his merit, becomes a servile parasite or vile panderer. Sailors, the naval gentlemen, come under the same description, only their vices assume a different and grosser cast. They are more positively indolent when not discharging the ceremonials of their station, whilst the insignificant fluttering of soldiers may be tenured active idleness. More confined to the society of men, the former require a fondness for humor and mischievous tricks, whilst the latter, mixing frequently with well-bred women, can catch a sentimental cant. May I be allowed to extend the comparison to a profession where more mind is certainly to be found, for the clergy have superior opportunities of improvement, the subordination almost equally cramps their faculties. The blind submission imposed at college to forms of belief serves as the novitiate to the curate, who must I'm just so angry. Obsequiously, that word, respect the opinion of his rector or patron if he means it to rise in his profession. Perhaps there cannot be a more forcible contrast between the servile dependent gait of a poor curate and the courtly mien of a bishop, and the respect and contempt they inspire render the discharge of their separate functions equally useless. It is of great importance to observe that the character of every man is in some degree formed by his profession. A man of sense may only have a cast of countenance that wears off as you trace his individuality, whilst the weak common man has scarcely ever any character but what belongs to the body. At least all of his opinions have been so steeped in the vat consecrated by authority that the faint culprit which the grape of his own vine yields cannot be distinguished. Society, therefore, as becomes I'm sorry, I was so angry that I plugged my nose up with just stuff. Society, therefore, as it becomes more enlightened, should only be therefore careful to not establish bodies of men who must necessarily be made foolish or vicious by the way of the constitution of their profession. In the infancy of society, when men are just emerging out of barbarism, chiefs and priests, touching the most powerful springs of savage conduct, hope, and fear, must have been had an unbounded sway. An aristocracy, an aristocracy, of course, is naturally the first form of government. But clashing interests soon losing their equipoise, a monarchy and a hierarchy break out of the confusion of ambitious struggles, and the foundation of both is secured by feudal tenures. This appears to be the origin of monarchical and priestly power and the dawn of civilization. But such combustible materials cannot long be pent up, and, getting vent in foreign wars and intestine insurrections, the people acquire some power and tumult, which obliges their rulers to gloss over the oppression with a shrew of right. Thus, as wars, agriculture, commerce, literature expand the mind, despots are compelled to convert corruption, hold fast the power which was formerly snatched by open force. I'm just going to reread that sentence one more time for emphasis. Despots are compelled to make covert corruption hold fast the power which was formerly snatched by open force. And this baneful lurking gangrene is most quickly spread by luxury and superstition, the sure dregs of ambition. The indolent puppet of a court first becomes luxurious monster or fastidious sensualist, and then makes the contagion which this unnatural state spread the instrument of tyranny. It is the pestiferous purple which renders the progress of civilization a curse and warps the understanding, till men of sensibility doubt whether the expansion of intellect produces a greater portion of happiness or misery. But the nature of the poison points out the antidote, and had Rousseau mounted one step higher in his investigation, or could his eye have pierced through the foggy atmosphere which he had almost disdained to breathe, his active mind would have darted forward to contemplate the perfection of man in the establishment of true civilization, instead taking his ferocious flight back to the night of sensual ignorance. I'm just gonna sit here a moment and process that. I said earlier at the beginning of this stream that I am a lifelong anarchist. Over a decade, I've been a community volunteer both in and out of anarchist orgs since I was 15. And I have always found a certain suspicion in higher offices, because the pageantry of it, as she says, the indolence of it, how nothing ever really seems to change. And I want to assert before going into my final reading, which is extremely brief, that, again, whatever happens, there's so much work to do. So my final reading is going to be an excerpt. It's going to be a poem. Phoebe does a poetry reading from a 1935 copy of Windsor Quarterly, which is a collectivist, left-wing, generally early Marxist quarterly that was published way back late, I, I believe, early 30s to mid 40s. There's a story behind why I own this, and I'm also not exaggerating. But yeah, it's published by a farming collective out in Arkansas way back in the day. And I'm going to read Dear Mr. President. I'm going to give a quick bio of this guy. And I really, again, I want to reiterate that this was written in 1935. So the just very quick bio of the author. Harlan Quippen is 20 years old and is active in labor organization. He has published one poem in New Masses. He is now engaged in writing short stories of farm life. I can't believe this thing is almost 100 years old now, and things don't change. A Letter to the President by Harlan Quippen. Mr. President, I listened. The radio news movie said we are on our way. I listened, and I heard this all over America. The president says, drive the money changers from the temple. Yes, it will be all right now. But today America is speaking. We are shooting the cattle. The kids never have milk. We can't afford it now, said Mrs. Brown. Plowing under cotton, Mrs. Jones told us that Janie didn't have clothes to go to school. Restricting wheat acreage, the doc says little Jim died of malnutrition. I guess he means that Jim starved. And building a navy second to none. They are preparing bullets instead of bread, the man said, and many people raised their fists. America, a voice of itself, the angry throat is speaking. Now we know, not the hunger-sucked bodies of children, but the thatch of belching mouths of cannon must be fed. Budget requirements mean not bread, but cold, gray steel of destroyers be sent to Cuba, or is it China, where American lives and property are to be endangered? Or, wait, was it only Morgan's investments? Numbers upon a white page, $2 billion for national defense. Half hidden in swirling snow, the gray figure of a man, shivering before the silver-slivered wind. We understand, Mr. President, necessity, but others. We will try to explain, Mr. President, to our stomachs the necessity of hunger, and the necessity of battleships, the dangers threatening American investments, the unimportance of stomachs. The New Deal is a conception of a fuller and more abundant life for everyone. Mars in masquerade as social security, a lady of mercy, blobbering at the mouth of blood, a Tommy gun wavering in the hands of a dying beast. We shall do our best, Mr. President, to suckle our children at the blunt iron breasts of cartridges, to gorge and fatten ourselves upon your bayonets, and bloat upon the thin, sharp wine of gas. Properly raised, nourished upon such fare, our muscles shall be sheaths of steel, our breath of flame, and our hearts a bomb of hate shall burst these chains. And I know that sounds a bit #pretty edgy too deep, but I really want to say that it bears repeating that that was written in 1935 by a farmhand in Arkansas. Things aren't changing, and I want them to change. And if you're watching this, there's a good chance you want them to change too. So I'm just gonna soapbox for 1 minute more here before I sign off into the good night. Um, be kind to yourself and to others, but most importantly, be kind to the future of others. My anarchism, my loathing of this current situation that we find ourselves in, perpetually even, comes from a place of intense compassion. And ultimately, I don't see how the status quo of this whiplash of blue and red, so the same. Libertarians, you're in there too. Everyone's in there. Um, I don't see how continuing to uphold that system, to engage in it, to believe in it, to support it, to perpetuate a system of constant domination, a system which has the knife at the forever throat of the disempowered of society, of people of color, the working class. I don't see how one can hold that, that mutual contradiction. Um, and this isn't me asking you to suddenly go burn it all down, although my FBI agent, my assigned FBI agent, probably already knows my opinion on that. But what I will say is stop counting on the state, stop counting on the government. Participate in local elections. That's democracy we can engage in. Um, work at your soup kitchen. Volunteer with a local interfaith organization. Talk to someone who is sitting alone on a bench somewhere, looking really lost. Because whatever happens tomorrow morning, and whatever is actually happening right now, we really need each other, and we need each other to be able to rebuild this imaginary thing, this thing that never really existed in the first place. This, I don't know, it's a bit ironic. Um, it is pretty ironic, actually, because I will say that in this core of compassion, there is a part of me that I do wish wholeheartedly that this system could work, that reform could work, but I think as we saw back in 2012 and as we saw in 2016, and whatever we see tomorrow morning, it's going to take a lot more. It's going to take a hell of a lot more than just some symbolic change of despots. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for me. Just if you're an American, I'm thinking of you right now, and I hope you could just kind of hold space for me too. I'm not going to do the corny sign off I usually have because it's just not a good time. I think we're all feeling a little. It's a grief. It's terminal grief. It's the naked heart. Anyway, you have a good evening. Be safe. Be kind to yourself. And just be good to someone else.